This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
And it is Ring Rees-Mogg with Conservative Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I've said before, hardly a day goes by where there isn't headlines about various aspects of Brexit. So instantly, Mr. Rees-Mogg, I refer you to the front page of this morning's Times. Brussels and Brexiteers united in anger over budget extension. This is the possibility that Britain will help to determine the EU's £1 trillion budget up to 2027 after European countries defied Brussels and invited UK officials to take part in negotiations. I'll show you the paper. As someone who's had the pleasure of getting to meet you over the last couple of months, you don't really strike me as a particularly angry man who gets particularly strident or furious. Are you angry this morning, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
No, I've seen the story, and actually I spoke to Oliver Wright, the very distinguished journalist who wrote it.
He's the policy editor of the paper.
He's the policy editor of the paper, and very well informed. But no, so often headlines say people are angry about something which they're concerned about, or they think is not being done well. The idea that politicians spend their whole life in a lather of fury is, I think, much exaggerated and wouldn't be a good way of conducting politics. Having said that, I think we need to be very careful about being in the budget discussions, because if you're in the discussions, is there a risk that you begin to take responsibility for decisions and then you find that you get a bill at the end of it?
So how would you characterise it? If you don't like that particular headline, how would you write that story?
I would say that there is concern that people want a clean Brexit. Once we've left the European Union, and we may be involved in the Erasmus programme or something like that, but that will be a standalone issue to which we will contribute a set amount of money, but we have no standing with regard to the EU's total budget. That's a matter for them, and we would no more want to discuss that with them than we would expect them to go to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and say, before you draw up your budget, will you bear this in mind?
Plenty more other matters to discuss. One last Brexit aspect before we come. Kieran, you're going to be the first caller. A report last week, Mr. Rees-Mogg, from HMRC suggesting that the cost of business could be in the region of £20 billion. How did you don't do anger, but how did you react to that?
By analysis, it seems a very high figure that our total trade, both imports and exports with the EU, is £400 billion or thereabouts. So you're talking about a 5% transaction fee. Well, that's much higher than a fee on any other financial transaction. So why would it be so high? It doesn't cost 5% to collect VAT. Why would it cost 5% to collect customs dues, if there were any? And is it that much on imports coming in through Southampton, for example, which are mainly non-EU, where there's a working system up and running currently? So I think when you examine the figure, it looks inflated. So
HMRC Chief Executive got his numbers wrong?
He's taken it from a particular survey. It's not his own survey, as I understand it. So it's an estimate. Even he said that it wasn't a precise figure.
Let's go to the calls. Kieran's in Romford. Kieran, you're on the radio. What are you going to say? Good morning.
Morning, Nick. Morning, Jay.
Hello, sir.
Good morning, Kieran.
Morning. As a business owner of a small European express courier company, will the express transport industry survive outside the customs union and single market when we become a third country?
It would be very surprising if it didn't, that there are express deliveries between Switzerland and the European Union, and Switzerland remains a third country. That I think there are a lot of scare stories around how business will operate, but you can get express deliveries from the UK to the United States, that it is perfectly possible to implement and work through customs procedures in a highly efficient and streamlined way. But there will be some changes, because we will not be in the customs union and we will not be in the single market. Response from you, Kieran?
Right. If I can give you some hands-on experience of where I've been, I've been to every border and country in Europe. I've done a job to Switzerland before. I've exported £100,000 worth of exhibition equipment for a medical company from Cambridge. I got sent down what was called a Route 1 at Customs House in Dover. I was there for 7 hours. I then got to the Swiss border. I was there for 5 hours, and I missed the first day of the exhibition. They had to pay a 20% down payment on their temporary imports for their machines that they wanted to exhibit. They missed the first day. It cost them about £10,000, and they were deeply, deeply unhappy. This is not a frictionless border. The Swiss border is not frictionless. You have to stop. You have to go out of your van or your vehicle in your truck. You have to go up four flights of stairs to find your customs agent. You have to get your T1 or T2 forms processed, or your carnet, depending on what you're doing. Then you have to get them stamped by the French, the Swiss, then you can come in. The same applies to Customs House in Dover. There's no infrastructure there. There's no parking. At the moment, you can go there at the right time. You might be in and out in 30, 40 minutes. But when everybody has to clear their customs papers, it will be an absolute nightmare. I just want to know how you can respond to that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, it's a question of having the right infrastructure in place and the systems that deal with this. That if you look at the imports and exports via Southampton to the rest of the world, these are hugely efficient and streamlined because that's what they're focused on. But the issue with Dover is it's not primarily focused on non-EU movements at the moment. Once we're outside the EU, Dover will have to become a streamlined port. Otherwise, they'll find that they lose business to other ports.
Won't we suffer the problems we have that gentleman suffered in Switzerland? Why would Switzerland have been at it for years, and they clearly haven't done very well with it? At least is what I take from what Kieran's telling us.
Kieran is telling us about an incident where he had a particularly difficult time getting through Switzerland. I appreciate that. I wasn't trying to minimise it. But the Swiss-EU border is most of the time a very efficient border with very limited delays, as is the Norway-Sweden border. Norway being
border is much smaller than the UK border. You can go via Gothenburg into Norway and clear customs there at a physical hard border checkpoint. You go from Hirtshals to Larvik and clear at the port in Larvik. It's tiny.
There are checks indeed between Norway and Sweden, because Norway is in the single market but not in the customs union. But the border is an efficient border that you can have, and there are many efficient borders globally, and that is what we should be trying to do. That's what government policy is, to have as seamless as possible. But there will be some changes, of course.
I'll let you make your final point, Kieran, because there are. So this will be your final observation, but make a final point to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Kieran?
There's not one single white paper that the government has yet produced on road transport apart from permits for trailers, including caravans and private trailers over 750 kilos. Everybody would be affected. Driving licences would be affected. And they're also saying, according to the European Union white paper, it says you'll need a transport manager that must be a resident in an EU country and you must have a premises. This is going to put small to medium-sized businesses out of business overnight. We won't be able to compete, and all you're going to have is the large companies running it. I'll tell you something. One last thing from me. I transport exhibitions. I transport car parts for the just-in-time production line. I transport AOG airport on ground parts. I do band work for concerts. They cannot go by truck. They must go by van. They rely on the smooth and frictionless transport over borders from Dover to Calais, where you do not stop to clear customs. There's nowhere to stop, and it'd be an absolute disaster when it does.
All right, I have to finish there. Final rejoinder from you.
There will be a white paper. There is a bill on transport going through the House of Commons at the moment, and the issue with driving licence is one at the forefront of the Department of Transport's mind already, and they have a solution in sight. So I think the fears are being overstated.
Kieran, do stay in touch. Thank you. Please understand, you have had a long crack of the whip. We move on. Mike in Wimbledon, you're up next. Mike, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Yes.
Good morning.
So my question is, if it became clear to Mr. Rees-Mogg that Brexit would do damage to this country economically in the short term and long term, and in terms of our influence and power in the world around us, short term and long term, and the public as a whole are clearly losing their appetite for this project, would he respect any change of heart on the part of the British public, or would he push ahead with his own preferred vision?
Well, Mike, thank you for the question, which slightly loaded question, which I think gives your view of the issue. The British people voted to leave, well aware of the scare stories, the Project Fear, the plague of frogs that we were going to get, none of which has happened. So the evidence so far is that this is false, that the economy is surviving, is doing well, and that the economy will continue to thrive.
Not as well as other zones, other countries in the Eurozone.
Having done much better than them for the previous few years. There are cycles within economies, and that shouldn't be any surprise. That's just the normal course of events, but we seem to be picking up again now. And the Eurozone has a few problems. I don't know if we're going to discuss Italy at any point, but there are one or two issues in Europe. And the British people voted, and it comes down to, do you respect democracy? And we see in Italy, it's absolutely fascinating, that they don't respect democracy in the end, that the majority went for the five-star movement and for the League, and then the president vetoes one of their appointments and appoints somebody from the IMF, a former economist at the IMF, to become prime minister. And this is just the European establishment insisting that they know best, when the EU's economic performance is disastrous. Look at the levels of youth unemployment across the EU. We've done so much better because we've been out of the euro. We will do better still once we're outside the European Union altogether.
What's the future for Italy, Jacob Rees-Mogg, in the next coming months?
It's very interesting. I wouldn't hold myself up as an expert on Italian politics, but if what one reads in the paper is true, and there's a new election in September, and it's fought on a democracy basis, I would have thought there's a high chance that the five-star movement and the League do better next time than they did this time, and that faces the European Union with a greater challenge than Brexit.
And coming back to Mike's point, which is he is rather betraying which way he stands, but if it is seen that Brexit would be detrimental to the country, would you ever see changing your stance?
Well, I disagree with Mike's premise, that I think it's enormously economically positive.
Let's bring him back in, Mike.
Yes, quite. I asked a concrete question, and Mr. Rees-Mogg happily drifted off into the fog.
Well, I took him to Italy, in fairness, so come back to your question.
Himself respects democracy and the will of the people, in that should the will of the people change when they have clearly put a deal before them, would he respect that will of the people, or is this an option that he is locking off because, like elites himself, he prefers to guide the country down his own preferred route?
Well, I don't know if it's his own preferred route. I remind you of the way the vote went, but Jacob Rees-Mogg.
That's the point, Mike. There was a vote. And to say, well, why don't we change our mind before the vote that we had in 2016 has actually been implemented, to say that you think that a few people might have changed their mind, a few mates in the pub. We had the biggest democratic exercise in our nation's history. 17.4 million people voted to leave. And of course that should be implemented. If in 30 years' time the UK wants to rejoin, that would be a matter for the electorate then. But this result must be respected and it must be implemented. Otherwise, we would find our democracy held in as much contempt as that in Greece and Italy by the European Union.
Mike, thank you. Democracy in a different light now. Shelley in Belfast. Shelley, your question to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning.
Good morning. Should Northern Ireland follow the Republic of Ireland and change its abortion laws?
This is a result of that referendum on the weekend,
yes.
Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, Shelley, there are two parts of this. One is my view on abortion, which is well known. I believe that life starts at the point of conception, and the life within the womb is worthy of protection. And I was very struck by Jim Shannon yesterday on the radio saying that there are 100,000 people alive in Northern Ireland who would not be alive if Northern Ireland had the abortion laws that the rest of the United Kingdom
Were you
has.
dismayed by the result in the Republic of Ireland?
I was saddened by the result in the Republic of Ireland. So my view on that is clear. But on this issue, it's really one of devolution, that this responsibility is devolved to Northern Ireland. And if you respect our devolution constitutional settlement, then these issues ought to be decided in the right place. And
but we haven't got a right place at the moment, as you'll be aware, of course.
I'm aware that the Assembly isn't currently sitting, but this is one of the reasons for encouraging the Northern Irish politicians to bring their Assembly back together so that they can settle these issues that are their responsibility. I think once you start picking and choosing on the devolution settlement, you might find that you do great damage to the Union, because what if this was Scotland? What would be the result in Scotland if English MPs decided that they would overturn some policy of the SNP? I think it's quite a dangerous approach to take in terms of our constitutional settlement.
But Baroness Chakrabarti, who's the Shadow Attorney General, says we're calling on Mrs May, a self-identifying feminist, to negotiate with the parties in Northern Ireland to legislate without further delay, obviously not seeing the need for the Assembly, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, Baroness Chakrabarti wants to ignore the devolution settlement, and I think she is ignoring that very important part of the Constitution. And the devolution settlement, it's worth remembering, is one very much set up by a Labour government, not a Conservative government. And how the Constitution works is important. It's how democracy is defended and operates.
Let's get Shelley back in. Shelley, who asked the question. You're back on the radio?
Yep.
Shelley, you're back on. What would you say to what you heard from?
I think Theresa May ought to be pressurising the DUP. I know she's reluctant to do that for obvious reasons. But this situation has left women in Northern Ireland with no one to appeal to. We have no government. We have, as I know in my own family, my own son has just lost his baby son through a termination for fatal fetal abnormality, and they had to go to England. And so we're the only part of the UK now that has to travel to another country to get the health care that other women are entitled to.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Shelley, the personal circumstances must be enormously distressing, and thank you for coming on LBC to discuss it, because I think that's very courageous of you. The Prime Minister should, of course...
It's ridiculous, though, that woman's son's girlfriend had to come elsewhere to the United Kingdom, isn't it?
The Prime Minister would be right to encourage all the parties in Northern Ireland to put the Assembly back together again. It is important that the devolved structures in Northern Ireland operate. So, to that degree, I agree with what Shelley is saying, but then the decision must be taken according to the democratic operations in Northern Ireland, though my view is what my view has always been.
But what about a referendum for Northern Ireland on the subject?
I'm in favour of referendums. I think they're a good way of settling issues.
I mean, it seems to be going against your way of thought as regards abortion, it has to be said, Mr. Rees-Mogg. If you look at Ireland, the Irish Republic.
Yes, that's absolutely true, but my role, Mr. Ferrari, is to put my arguments and to emphasise the importance of life and the beginning of life. But democracy must determine the laws, and in a way, it's what society feels that is more important than the law. There's no point in passing laws that society is overwhelmingly against, and therefore referendums become a good way of settling these very difficult moral issues.
Shelley, thank you. Good luck to your son's girlfriend getting through that ordeal. Catherine's in Romford. You're on the radio. Good morning, Catherine. What are you going to say?
Good morning. Pleasure to speak to you, Jacob.
Well, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question about extra funding for the NHS. I think it's clear that the NHS does need extra funding, but my concern is that any extra money going to the NHS may end up in the hands of the big pharmaceutical companies that appear to be charging some very inflated prices for medicines, including over-the-counter medicines, but also important medicines such as thyroid, T3 medication and epilepsy drugs, where the price inflation has been as high as 6,000%. How would you resolve that issue?
Well, thank you, Catherine. There are two different issues with pharmaceutical pricing, essentially. One is that you found that when drugs have become generic, that they've lost their patent protection, they have found there have been very few manufacturers who have been able to put prices up enormously. And this is a huge distortion of the system, and is a legitimate area for governments to try and pull prices back, to find other producers, or indeed simply to say to the firms, we will not pay these prices. The second issue is on new drugs, which are enormously expensive to develop, and the clinical trials are very lengthy. Most drugs do not pass from clinical trials into being used by patients. So there's a very large number of failures, and that all needs to be paid for. So the high price of new drugs is generally justifiable. The high price of generics is not, and that is an area where it is legitimate for government to act.
Let's get a response from Catherine. Catherine?
Well, I think that still the NHS need to do, and the government need to do a little bit more on this. For example, with the thyroid drug T3, where there's been a 6,000% price hike, in all other countries in the world, the cost of that drug per month is about £25, but in the UK, it's about £900. And the NHS has been paying that for several years and has now started to restrict that medication for patients because of the price. So patients are suffering. So I do think the government needs to step in and sort out some of the issues with these big pharma companies.
Quick response from you, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, the obvious response on T3 is that if other governments can source it more cheaply, the British government should source it more cheaply, and it's just a question of going to a different supplier.
Let's get some emails. I'll come to... Thank you, Catherine. Mikhail, come to your call in just a second. This comes from Kenneth in Dartford. Now the Speaker of the Lords says there should be an investigation into the Speaker of the Commons, John Bercow, for allegations as to his behaviour. Does Jacob Rees-Mogg agree an inquiry is necessary?
It's none of the business of the Speaker of the House of Lords. It's not for him to get involved in the House of Commons. The two chambers regulate themselves. It's entirely a House of Commons matter. And as
to his central point.
Well, no, but I think this is really important, that the Speaker of the House of Commons should not get involved in the Lords, and the Speaker of the Lords should not get involved in the Commons. And I'm not sure Lord Fowler's comments have been entirely fairly phrased or paraphrased in this sense. I'm not sure he has directly said what is attributed to him, because he's a very sensible man and he knows the constitutional position. On the broader issue, I'm a great admirer of John Bercow's. I think he's been a very important reforming speaker who has helped the House of Commons hold the government to account. But he has a temper, and some people do. I think if you were to say that nobody in public life were ever allowed to lose his temper, we wouldn't have many people left in public life. I don't think that there's any evidence that he is a bully. And dare I say that Black Rod, a general of many years standing, who seemed to be frightfully upset that the Speaker banged the table, was not quite what one expects of a general.
We move on. Mikel is in East Croydon. Mikel, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate that. I just wanted to ask your guest...
Mr. Rees-Mogg, yes?
Yes, Mr. Rees-Mogg, sorry about that.
That's right, don't worry, Mikel. Good of you to call.
Thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to ask you, this morning, Commissioner Dix said they're going to remove videos from YouTube pertaining to drill music, pertaining to the state of violence going on. I just want to ask, considering you're a representative of the government, how will that stop the violence?
Okay, I'll just don't go. I'm just going to... Mr. Rees-Mogg isn't really representative of the government. He is a Conservative MP, and this is the fact that the Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, for those who are new to the story, is a little dismayed. She'd hoped that YouTube would take more of these so-called drill music videos away. It's now been discovered they being YouTube, deleted just over half, which is not as much as the Met requested. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, I've never watched any of these videos. So
have you ever heard the music?
No.
Well, this is your opportunity.
Oh,
here we go. Yes, here's some...
Time, yeah, take man's face off. And I done trap time, what a day job. Jump out with a massive takeoff. See feds in the red, they be race off. Out late in the ring with the riders lurking. Did the petrol run, cause the petrol's low.
What is your music of choice normally, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Not quite this.
And what they're saying is that I'm literally saying I'm going to come to your gang and in street talk I'm going to stab you. I'm going to kill you because you've dissed me in some way. That is what they're doing. These videos are specifically targeted. That's what I'm going to do. The Met Police Commissioner sees them as a lead into, as indeed some judges commented as well.
Yeah, I think it's very important with these things to see what evidence there is for the effect that this type of music has and whether it really does or not. Sometimes one feels it becomes a bit of displacement activity and that the police who ought to be out there doing more stop and searches and arresting people for carrying knives and so on and so forth take the target of something that is unpleasant and nobody would particularly encourage, but actually...
Because then we take our eye off the ball and we're all looking at the music.
That's right. That clearly the actual committing of crime is more important than the music. But I'd make a broader point that we should be worried about the unaccountability of the YouTubes, the Googles, the Facebooks, to have information on them that publishers, in the normal sense, would not be allowed to put up. And I think the internet giants ought to take on the responsibilities of publishers because that is what, in effect, they are.
Quick response from you, Mikel.
Well, me personally, I come from a Nigerian background. And
you come from a what background, my friend? A what?
Nigerian background.
Nigerian, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and within my household, the way I was brought up, I grew up with a mother and a father. So it's funny when they constantly come out with what the problem is. I mean, personally, from my point of view, the problem starts right at the home. It starts from when you're bringing up, especially boys. So
is music a contributory factor, would you say at all, Mikel, or is it, as Mr. Rees-Mogg suggests, a bit of a sideshow?
I think music is just a sideshow because you've had hip-hop for years spouting out its violence and its misogyny, and nobody seems to say anything about bringing the videos down. Okay. I mean, we've actually turned those artists into heroes, such as Jay-Z.
Okay.
We've actually sent. He's like a role model now.
Yes, I do. Is he a role model to you, Mr. Jay-Z?
Mikhail is much better informed on these matters than I am, and I would suggest compulsory Gregorian chant might be a good way of reducing the problem.
I love the idea of a Gregorian. Mikhail, we're not in any way belittling. It's a very important conversation, and the only reason I'm finishing in, I've got a couple of minutes left, and I need to get some more calls on. Mikhail, thank you for your input. Talk again soon. Sylvia's in County Durham. Sylvia, you're on the radio. Your question to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning, Nick. Good morning.
Hello.
Good morning, Sylvia.
It's a huge pleasure to be speaking to you. Straightforward question. You say you won't put yourself forward as leader of the party if the position arises, but if your colleagues are with you...
A bit like the Speaker, you were dragged kicking and screaming to the chair.
Sylvia, thank you. This reminds me of, yes, Prime Minister and Jim Hacker giving a long-winded answer saying he doesn't want it himself, but if his friends and colleagues advise him. Look,
you are Jim Hacker?
I'm not Jim Hacker, no.
Well, you've just said you remind you.
No, it reminds me of that conversation from Yes, Prime Minister. Sylvia, I'm very flattered you should suggest this, but I'm a backbench MP, and the Conservative Party in government always selects somebody from the cabinet. I want Mrs May to carry on. I think it's very important she's there to deliver Brexit. And my ambition is that Brexit should be delivered properly.
Didn't say she can't carry on. She said, as and when the opportunity arose, if you were dragged. So and they said, you are our hero, Mr. Rees-Mogg. I think Boris Johnson once said if the ball came out of the back of the scrum, I know you're more of a cricket buff.
Yes.
So if the opportunity goes into bat as night watchman or something, I don't know, and go to Lords, whatever the expression is.
Mr. Ferrari, I think this is becoming rather an elaborate hypothesis. And people aren't just dragged into it. They have to throw their hat into the ring. And I've always thought if I ever did, my hat would be thrown back to me in double quick time. But, Sylvia, thank you very much for your very flattering question. It's that I'm going to carry on backing Brexit and Theresa May.
Yes.
And that I'm not...
But when Theresa May says, that's it, I've delivered a Brexit, even Jacob is happy...
Well, then I can retire to Somerset if I'm happy with Brexit.
That's your role. OK, thank you. Actually, I mentioned the Speaker. You didn't actually say whether an inquiry is necessary or not. You paid tribute to him. Do you think we need to investigate what might or might not have gone on with Mr Burko?
I don't think an inquiry is necessary, no. I think, to go back to my central point,
sure,
the Speaker is a very good Speaker, but he does sometimes lose his temper. And I think you just have to accept that. And that's how he is. But it doesn't diminish his very fine qualities as Speaker. And other people in public life no doubt lose their temper too.
Yes. I think it was Ken Clarke who said, wasn't it, if we're not careful, there'd be no one in the chamber if everybody had to go saying use the word stupid or something.
Well, what did the great Ken Clarke say about the Prime Minister?
Bloody difficult woman?
Quite. And everyone thought, well, that's dear old Ken, and that's
I think she
splendid.
traded on it.
She did. She used it in one of her speeches.
Couple of questions as we're over. Right, I'll have to do them myself through emails. This comes from Casper in Bath. Nicola Sturgeon wants to relaunch her mission and restart an independence debate. Is she right?
No.
Thank you very much indeed. And lastly, this comes from Rachel in Bexley. Does Jacob Rees-Mogg, like me, mourn the decline of Marks and Spencer's? And would you ask him, does he get his underwear there?
I think there are some things that may reasonably be kept private even in public life. But Rachel, it's the way of the high street that you see over the decades companies come and they're enormously successful and then they become less successful. What's happened to the wonder of Woolies?
Yes.
And that's just the way it goes.
Yes.
And it's a very competitive, difficult business, made even harder by the internet.
And do you buy anything, Marks and Spencer's? Can I at least say that, clothing-wise?
Clothing-wise, my main supply of clothing is not Marks and Spencer's.
So I don't suggest even for your undergarments, I fear not.
But possibly my socks.
There we go. We'll draw a veil over that because Jacob Rees-Mogg on Ring Rees-Mogg again. Pleasure having you. Thank you. Listen to LBC where news is next.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has told LBC he was saddened by the result in Ireland's referendum on liberalising its abortion laws. The Conservative MP also says it should be up to Northern Ireland, not Westminster, to decide whether it wants to follow the Republic. The head of a leading hospital trust says the NHS must do more to